Well, hello and welcome to the Waters and Stanton video channel. My name is Peter Waters, call sign G30JV. Glad you could join me. Sometimes the videos that we produce are as a result of questions that were asked, and a question that I suppose really I've been asked throughout the whole of my ham radio life in terms of the business side of it is, what is the best HF transceiver for me? It comes from either somebody that's starting out or somebody that is going to upgrade. It's a monumental question, and clearly there is no exact answer. One of the things that I regularly say to customers before we even discuss the various transceivers, one of the first things I say is, look, you've got to understand that whether you spend £500 or £600 on an HF transceiver, or whether you spend £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 on an HF transceiver, the guy at the other end won't know, he won't tell the difference. The amount you pay for your transceiver is not reflected in what the guy at the far end generally hears. Okay? Now, it's quite interesting actually, because if I was to spend £500 on a guitar, I'd expect a fairly good sound. If I expected £3,000 on the guitar, I'd expect a far, far better sound. I'd expect you, the listener, would hear the difference. Same if I bought a keyboard. If I bought a keyboard for £500, well, okay, it'd probably sound pretty good these days, but it wouldn't match the £3,000 or £4,000 keyboard, which is quite strange really, because when we come to ham radio, the difference in the radios, generally speaking, is not what you hear. Now, another thing that I'd like to mention is, I heard this the other day actually, in fact I've heard it several times. I bought the transceiver because I like the look of it, and I realise now that was a mistake. Well, I can understand that statement, and to some extent I agree with it, but in some ways I disagree with it, because if you buy a transceiver that you don't like the look of, you're never ever going to be happy with it. Now, some people buy the transceivers because if they like the look of it, they like the layout. It's pretty dials, big screen, etc, etc. Some people have a more practical approach. If they've got a visual problem, they may like a particular colour background on the screen, or they may like a large screen. I have to say, of course, that a lot of the modern transceivers now, not all of them, but a lot of them, you can plug an external screen into it, so you've got a much larger screen. So that really overcomes that problem. But the fact is that if you don't like the look of the transceiver, you're not really going to live with it. So there we are. That's for starters. That's the advice I give you for starters. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to give you the names or model numbers of transceivers that I think you should consider, because they've all got advantages and disadvantages. But what I will say is that if you're going to buy yourself a new HF transceiver, particularly if it's the first time or you're going to spend a significant amount of money, then I would stick to the names that have a reputation. Icom, Yaesu, Ellicraft. Now, I've missed out Kenwood for a very good reason. Kenwood makes some excellent transceivers. In fact, they were market leaders many years ago in the HF stakes. They produced some wonderful transceivers. They seem to have lost interest in the market, and the latest information I have is that they're no longer making ham radio equipment. I don't know whether that's true or not. I wouldn't be surprised, because we've seen no new models coming from Kenwood, and so it looks to me as if Kenwood are coming out of the ham radio market. Great shame, but that is where we are at the moment. So stick to a name that's got a reputation. When I say reputation, I mean it's got a pedigree, it's got a history. So Yaesu, ICOM, Elecraft, been going for years. Another thing to remember is that in this day and age, unlike perhaps it was, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago, none of them make a bad transceiver. None of them make a bad transceiver. Now, some of you may say, okay, well, I had this XYZ transceiver and it was a problem. All transceivers can develop problems, and there can always be the Friday afternoon one, I suppose. But as models go in the current range of transceivers, none of them are bad. None of them are going to let you down. They're all good models from a company who for years and years have been making transceivers. So ICOM, Yaesu and Elecraft, keep those in mind, you won't go far wrong. Yes, I know there's a lot of other radios coming along. There's some from the Far East, which on paper look very, very good, and the cost is very, very good, but there's no pedigree. You don't know what's going to happen next year or the year after. One of the things that I think you must accept and must consider is that if you're going to spend a lot of money on a transceiver, then most of you will want to make sure that it's a sound investment. It's not a sort of a duff investment. So that's why I say stick to the brand names. There's nothing wrong on the face of it with some of these other lesser known brands. And if you've got the spare cash and you want to try them out, then that's fine, that's up to you. You may be very, very pleased, but you may not. So my suggestion is, if you're starting out, stick to one of the brands that I've mentioned, and you won't go wrong. Now, oh dear, the prices. They start from what, £700 to £800, go up to £4,000 or £5,000. There are differences, and as I said at the outset, that the strange thing is that the guy at the other end will not know what transceiver you're using or how much you spent on it by listening to it. Now that is good, I think it's very good, because if you've got a limited budget, it still means that you can put out a decent signal and compete with Joe Bloggs. Poor old Joe Bloggs is always brought into the conversation, isn't he? You compete with Joe Bloggs, who spent £4,000 or £5,000 on his radio. He's highly delighted with it, and he's got the cash and he bought it, and okay, good on him. But your £700, £800, £900 transceiver will sound exactly the same. So the question you're now going to ask, I know, is, well, what is the difference? What is the point of paying more money for some of these more expensive transceivers? I think we can divide the differences into two areas. One is functionality and the other is receiver performance. Let's talk about receiver performance first of all. One of the things that you will notice when you operate on the HF bands is there's all manners of interference, noise, etc., etc. Pips, squeaks, bangs, crashes, and whatever. A transceiver that has got a well-designed receiver section has probably got all sorts of extra goodies on. DSP. DSP means to say that you can combat certain amounts of noise. You can pull signals out of the noise. Selectivity. You can narrow the selectivity down. Dynamic range means to say that a loud signal will not affect a weak signal that perhaps you're listening to. A loud signal nearby will not affect the weak signal you're listening to. Strangely enough on HF, the ability to receive weak signals is not something which is really difficult to design into a transceiver. Plus the fact that most of us have got noise levels of about S5, S6, S7. So the absolute noise or the absolute sensitivity of the receiver is not particularly important. Having said that, they are all pretty good. So you've got the selectivity, you've got the DSP, signal processing, which can combat interference. Selectivity, dynamic range, you can move the passband around. All these things enable you to adjust your receiver to get the best out of it and to try and winkle some of those signals out, whether they be weakish signals in noise or whether they be in signals that have been sort of pressed either side with interference and so forth. So all these little goodies that are built into the receiver are an advantage. The guy at the other end doesn't know you've got them, but they're an advantage to you. And then you've got things like the band scope. You can have a panoramic display on the radio that shows you the activity on a segment of the band. Now, it's probably not so important on a crowded band, but on a band that is less crowded, perhaps 10 meters is pretty quiet, and perhaps you want to monitor it and see if there's anything activity. This is absolutely true. I had an Elecraft K, still got the Elecraft K3 actually. I had an Elecraft K3 with the panoramic adapter, and that had a width of 200 kilohertz. And I was doing some work in the office, and sorry about that, my phone's on. I was doing some work in the office, and I had this radio on 10 meters, and I saw on the display a little sort of, I had the waterfall display on, and I saw this sort of trace on the waterfall display, and I thought, 10 meters, gosh. And I thought, well, let's go down there. And I went down there, and it was a very faint display, and I listened, and it was a VK from Australia, but very, very weak, very weak. I could just determine the call, but very weak on SSB. And then within about 2 or 3 minutes, the signal came up. It was workable. I didn't actually work it, but it was workable. It was up to about S6 or 7, and he worked several stations in Scandinavia, and he went down again. Now, I would never have known that station was on 10 meters did I not have this panoramic adapter on. So a lot of the modern transceivers have got panoramic displays, and in those circumstances it's very useful. Data is quite useful as well. The waterfall section is very good. If you don't quite know what the waterfall display is, go onto YouTube and you'll see plenty of examples of waterfall displays. The IC7300 has a waterfall display. That's one of the top rigs at the moment in terms of popularity. And there is also technology now called SDR, Software Defined Radio. I won't really go into describing it, but basically it's the latest concept in receiver performance, receiver generation, and transmitter side. It's heavily focused on computer technology. Now, the good thing about SDR is because it's based on computer technology, in other words, there's computer systems built into your radio, if you like. Inside your radio, on a radio that's got SDR, it's got a computer system built in. The good thing about that is it can be programmed and reprogrammed. Now, what happens is that the manufacturer produces a transceiver based on SDR, and the IC7300 is an example of that. It produces a transceiver based on SDR, and then a year later they think, wait a minute, we could do this, we could add this feature. So a feature is added, and all you do then is you download the firmware from, in this case, the ICOM site, upload it into your transceiver, and you've got that extra feature. Now, Elecraft have been doing that for quite a few years now. Their transceivers are quite heavily based on firmware, and the ability to upgrade your transceiver without having to buy a new one is obviously an attractive feature. So SDR is important. Now, we're drifting on to what I call the functionality of a transceiver. Most of us operate PCs in our Radio Shack. We've got a PC, I've got one behind me. And the ability for that PC to interface with your radio is quite important. A lot of the modern radios now have a USB port, and that USB port means you can do all sorts of things with it. You can update your radio, as I've said, but you can also interface it with your PC. And for data, for the use of data and so forth, it's quite useful. Again, I'm going to have to use the IC7300 as an example, but it's not the only example. You can plug the IC7300 directly into your PC, and you can get the PC and the radio to exchange data. If you're going to operate data mode, then it's very essential that you can easily communicate your radio back into your computer. And it's a direct connection, direct USB connection, so it makes it very simple. So the functionality, memories, scanning, having blocks of memories, or having your favourite frequencies on a quick dial where you press a button or you rotate the dial. That's quite important. Auto ATUs, antenna ATUs. Well, a lot of transceivers have got antenna tuners built in. Now, let me just talk about that a bit. If you're operating on the HF bands, you're almost certainly going to want an antenna tuner at some point. Simple antenna, dipole, resonant on 20 meters, you can plug it straight into your transceiver, you don't need an antenna tuner. But as soon as you start to move about, you move to the band edges, the SWR might rise a bit, then you need an antenna tuner. If you're using something like a multi-band antenna, very often the SWR is not perfect, it starts to rise at the band edges, or one of the bands is not quite as good as the others, an antenna tuner. A lot of the transceivers have built-in antenna tuners, and I would suggest that you just consider that. You can have an external antenna tuner, in which case there's no point in having an internal one, but having said that, a lot of the transceivers now have them built in. I suppose the point I'm saying is that if you were to choose a transceiver that didn't have an antenna tuner built in, you're probably going to have to purchase one sooner or later. So even though the XYZ radio is a bit cheaper, if it hasn't got an antenna tuner built in, you're probably going to then have to buy an antenna tuner. So do consider that when you're working out your budget. So basically, buying an HF transceiver involves a number of considerations. But if you're working on a budget, then have a look at what you get and what you don't get. As I said before, 100 watts out of an SSB transceiver, whether it costs £700 or £800 or costs £3,000 or £4,000, is going to sound very, very similar, if not identical. Yes, transceivers have built-in things like equalizers, which will enable you to adjust the audio, transmitted audio to suit your voice. You'll have things like compressors, which gives you an extra punch. You can get, I mean, my experience is if you put a compressor in and adjust it properly, you'll probably get an extra 3 dB of torque power. So I like these, I don't know if you've heard on the radio, sometimes you hear these ads come up and they seem louder than the program you've been listening to. Well, it's not actually, well, it is louder subjectively, but it's actually not louder. The peak audio power is exactly the same as the program material, but what they do is they apply compression, high level of compression, and high level of compression, what it does, it increases the torque power. It raises the average. The peak is the same, but the average speech up there, instead of being like that with a sort of fairly wide dynamic range, the speech is compressed over a narrow band. Now, this gives you an increase in torque power. So if the radio's got compression on, then that's good. As I said earlier on, although I wouldn't buy a radio because it looks nice, I don't think I'd buy a radio if I didn't like the look of it. If I couldn't live with it, then I'd have to think, okay, well, yeah, something's got to give somewhere. When we're considering radio performance and receiver performance, there's a website you can go onto called sherwoodengineering.com. It's actually Shengwood, SHENGWOOD.com. They list all the major transceivers on there, and you can see immediately the performance. Basically, it's the performance of the receiver, and of course that makes sense really, because what we've been talking about is the fact that subjectively the differences are the ones that you would notice, not the guy at the other end. So it comes down to primarily to the receiver. Certainly Sherwood Engineering concentrate on the receiver performance. Now you can go on there and you can see the various models and where they are, and where they're at the top or middle or near the bottom. The only thing I would say is that we are talking, if we look at the ones at the top, perhaps the top 5 or 6, there's not a lot of difference between them. There's not a lot of difference. You might be hard pressed to put two of them beside each other and try and demonstrate on air the differences. They are quite small. So don't get too het up with the performances. Whether yours is number 1 or number 7 or 8 probably doesn't matter that much. Yes, I know that if you want the best, you're going to have to buy the best. It's rather like photography. You could spend a fortune on a lens and be really delighted with the performance you get from that lens. You could spend half the money on another lens, and subjectively you'd have to really study the picture and try and find some examples which showed your friend why or how you can justify spending so much money on a lens. It's not always easy. So there are differences, but if you're on a budget, don't get too concerned with it. I think if I was to have to say, make sure that you like the look of it. Make sure it comes from an established manufacturer. Yaesu, Icon, Ellicraft. Make sure it comes from an established manufacturer. Do consider the internal ATU, because I think it's quite important. Make sure, when I say make sure, it's up to you, but it's fairly important that you can connect it to a PC, because as time goes in your ham radio life, you'll realise that it is an advantage for logging, all sorts of things. It's nice to be able to connect your transceiver to your PC. So I don't think I've covered everything, but I hope I've covered enough to give you a bit more confidence in deciding what to buy. Now, if you ask your mates down at the club, they'll all give you ideas of what they think is great, and a lot of what you get is probably good information. The problem is, of course, a lot of the information would be conflicting as well. So if somebody, I heard somebody say the other day that they'd never buy one of those transceivers again because it was so noisy. Well, and this is a mainline transceiver. I really find that difficult to believe. Noise, generally speaking, comes down the aerial. So noise is noise, and it doesn't matter what transceiver you put there, you're going to hear noise. If it's badly adjusted, or if it's got a wide bandwidth, then the noise will appear to be worse. But as I said, I don't think there is a bad transceiver now. There is one that's far better than others for you, because it's your budget, it's got the features, but you're not going to buy a transceiver, I don't think at the moment, that is going to be a duff one. So there we are. Okay, I seem to have done an awful lot of talking in this video, and I hope that I've given you some information. Probably what I've done actually is I've replicated probably quite a long telephone call that I may have had in the past with customers that come on and wanted some advice, and clearly they were starting from scratch. So I hope I've covered enough to give you some information. As you know, we've got a big operation down at Portsmouth. We've got fully qualified staff, all licensed amateurs, that will quite happily guide you through when you're coming to the point when you want to place an order. Go onto our website, have a look. You'll see some competitive prices there. We're always happy to do deals. We do part exchange, and we give very good after-sales service. So there we are. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I've been able to give you some assistance, and don't forget, enjoy your ham radio, be careful, because we know we're still in this we're not semi-lockdown now, but anyway, be careful. It's nice to know that we can actually get out in the open now and do some portable operation. And enjoy your ham radio. Until the next time, bye for now.